And good afternoon. Welcome. It's Monday, 1 o'clock. And we're going to talk a little bit about inspections today. Thanks to Lisa Van Streen with your question. I know we've talked about inspections before, but today we're going to dig a little deeper and really talk about the dynamics of the whole inspection process and knowing your client. But first, before we get into that, I want to remind everybody to pass your Code of Ethics, go in and do your Code of Ethics training. I'm sure that each of your MLS boards has a link to the Code of Ethics training by the National Association of Realtors, and it is required in 2019 that all agents do their Code of Ethics training. So don't forget, it's really important that you get this done before the end of the year. Speaking of the end of the year, you all have by now, many of you at least, have seen our invitation to the Christmas party, as well as the outtakes. I take full responsibility. I owe a big debt to our team of creative people who worked really, really, really hard to try to make it look professional, but you have to consider what they were working with. But it was fun, and I hope that you all will enjoy the Christmas party. Make sure you respond to the invitation. We'd love to see you there. It's a lot of fun. So please do. Inspections. And I want to go, for inspections, I kind of want to go back to the very beginning of our relationship with our clients. And the very first thing that I encourage agents to do is know your client. Are they financially able to waive inspections, for example? And for example, will a furnace, if a furnace breaks, is that going to break their bank to replace it? Will even smaller items like a $900 water heater, is that going to be a financial hardship for them if it quits within the first few months? You got to know your client. I have an investor who always waives inspections, never has inspections. Why? Because he's a builder. He's flipped dozens of homes, and before he even sees a house, he expects to replace all the mechanical items: furnace, AC, water heater, appliances. He can spot termite and mold damage. He can tell if a roof needs replacing. His offer takes into consideration all of those things. It's not a situation where he's going to come back later and use the inspections to adjust the sales price or to get some kind of concession from the seller. He knows going into it what he expects to do. He's got $20,000 right out of his pocket to begin with, right out of the gate, before he even starts talking about carpeting and paint colors. So know your clients. I've also had, like many of you have had, those clients who are scraping together their last dime to close. And like I said, if a water heater breaks, are they going to will they not have the money to fix that? Those clients should never buy a house, in my opinion, without inspections, and you should discuss a home warranty with them. And it's really part of knowing your clients. How do you know your clients? Well, I establish expectations before I start showing homes. I sit down with clients and review the purchase agreement and inspections and the inspection contingency paragraph with buyers before I even start showing them houses. I have that meeting that I think I've mentioned to you before. I call CITO, come into the office, CITO, come into the office, and I sit with the clients and I go through the pre-qualification process, explain that we need a pre-qualification letter for the price of home that they're interested in. We discuss the purchase agreement, We talk about the buyer's agency contract and all of the forms that we're going to encounter along the way. The worst possible time that you can talk about inspections and the inspection process is when you're writing the offer for the house that they have just fallen in love with. They are focused, their head is in a different place than to understand a contract at that moment. So when I have my CETO come into the office meeting, I actually go through the process with them. Here's what's going to happen when we do inspections. We're looking for the big stuff. We're not going to sweat the small stuff, and we'll get into that in a moment. But that's what I do in that personal meeting. One of the issues that Eric and I run into a lot is that the agents themselves don't know what the inspection clause says or how to interpret it. And let me explain that there are various purchase agreements out there. A lot of our agents work with the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement, GRAR and WMLAR and the MOM Board and so on. Others are working with the Northern Great Lakes form, Cadillac and Traverse City, for example. A GCAR, a huge number of amount of our business is using the GCAR form. And all of those forms have different language in them about how to navigate the inspections. It's our job to know what that inspection paragraph says and the processes that we have to go to, the time frames and so on, that we have to operate within in order to protect our client, the buyer. I mean, think about your doctor. A doctor doesn't perform surgery until he's talked to you about the potential risks. The hospital and the doctor's office have you sign forms confirming that you understand the risks, that you're accepting the risks. They check, double check, triple check your wristband and your identity and your understanding of the procedure before they wheel you into the operating room. Okay? We're not surgeons, but we are held to professional standards. And knowing your client and explaining their options to them clearly is one of the most basic standards of professionalism, and realtors are expected to provide that to their clients. So, let's go back to that first meeting. Setting expectations. I always explain to a buyer that every house is going to have something wrong with it. Even a brand new house, even new construction, is going to have something wrong with it. And the question is, how much are they willing to accept or able financially to accept when they do inspections? The purpose of inspections is information gathering. It's to find out what the condition of the property is, not a means to negotiating the purchase price or getting concessions from the seller. It's to find out the condition of the property beyond what the seller's disclosure form might say. So I suggest to buyers that we start, when we go in for inspections, that what we're looking for is big stuff: roof, furnace, air conditioning, appliances, if they are included in the purchase agreement, hot water heater, structural issues, evidence of water, mold, asbestos, any of those kinds of things. If they have a swimming pool, for example, or underground sprinkling, or a chimney that is for a wood-fired, a wood-burning fireplace, those are all inspections that should be performed so that a buyer knows the condition of those things. If your buyer is purchasing a property with those things I mentioned, underground sprinkling, a swimming pool, underground swimming pool, for example, and air conditioning, if they're buying those the house with those things in it during January, the likelihood is that you're not going to be able to test for those things during the middle of January. It's going to be too cold. So, again, going back to expectations, if you explain to them that we're not going to be able to test the swimming pool, the underground sprinkling, or the AC, air conditioning, during January, do you want to proceed? How do you want to proceed? We can proceed here and say, you know what, we're going to accept it, take our chances that they work, and get a hold harmless signed by the buyer that they're not going to come back and say, hey, you were supposed to tell me that I had to have those things inspected. Or maybe you ask for an escrow to say, you know, we don't know that these things work, and we'd like to put some portion of funds in escrow until we can have them checked, and if they're all in working order, then release that money back to the seller. But you have to also make them aware that if you ask for that kind of thing in a purchase agreement, it may affect your ability to get your offer accepted. The seller may say, no, I'm not willing to do that. And your buyers, again, need to understand what the expectations might be or the outcomes might be before they go down that road. Excuse me. Again, looking for the big stuff. It's really important. I have 3 different purchase agreements here for us today. And it's really important that you and the buyer understand what the consequences are if they send over a repair addendum asking for repairs, or some concession from the seller as far as it results from the inspection contingency or the inspections being performed. Again, I try to tell my buyers, let's look for the big stuff. Let's focus on the big stuff, and unless they are just flat broke and anything is going to break the bank if it goes wrong, again, then you start looking for a home warranty. But the question I have for you is, if you're working with the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement, for example, then you know that submitting a repair addendum asking for repairs or concessions, that seller has the right to terminate the offer unilaterally. They can just say, thanks for your offer, appreciate everything you've done, but we're terminating the offer. And you can't go back and say, well, never mind, we'll take that back. You can't roll it back and rescind that offer. Now, what's interesting is that on some of the other purchase agreements, you can do that, provided the seller hasn't already signed it, but you're still waiting. You can do that under some of the other ones if it's still within the inspection period. So, again, we have to know our inspection period, our language in the purchase agreements that we're using in order to know what the consequences are. For example, as I mentioned, the seller can get out of a contract if you provide or if you submit a inspection addendum after the inspections are done under the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement. But that's not the case under the GCAR Purchase Agreement. The GCAR Purchase Agreement does not give the seller the right to unilaterally terminate the offer if the buyer submits a repair request or request for concessions. The language is very different, and I'm going to go through them here in a couple minutes. If you do provide, let's say you've gone through and you've done the inspections, and you've looked at the purchase agreement, you have a very clear understanding what are the time frames for the inspections, what happens if the buyer submits an addendum, does the seller have the right to terminate? Under some of them it does, on others it does not. What happens if the seller refuses to respond to the addendum in any way? Is the purchase agreement you are using a time is of the essence contract? These are things that you need to know about your purchase agreement that you're operating with. Here's one of the questions we get a lot of. If the buyer has 10 days to do inspections and you submit a repair addendum on day 7, which the seller agrees to, so as of day 7, you have an agreement on a repair addendum, there's going to be some sort of concession or repair done, can the buyer still decide to terminate on day 9? They're still within their 10-day inspection window. Why can't they terminate, or can they? This question came up recently, and I called Gail Anderson on it. I said, I need some clarification here. What happens when there is an addendum on day 7 that's been agreed upon, and can that buyer still use the next 3 days to get out of the contract? And her interpretation was, no, they can't. Then in essence, when the two parties agree to those concessions, they are changing the contract itself. That it is an amendment of the contract in its entirety. And that is essentially satisfying the inspection contingency. The 10 days no longer exist because the contingency is considered satisfied at that moment that the two parties agree to some resolution regarding the inspections. So, but it's still a little gray. And so if you run into this problem, I would be clear. I would make sure that whatever your addendum says, for example, the buyer hereby accepts property as is, provided seller replaces the furnace prior to closing at seller's expense. Verification that the replacement has been completed by a licensed heating and cooling contractor shall be provided to buyer no less than 4 days prior to closing. If this addendum is not accepted by some date, the purchase agreement shall be considered terminated and the earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer. When you write an addendum of any kind, or even when you write the purchase agreement and you're going to put something in there under other conditions or whatever, you have to remember 3 things about contract writing. Number 1, you have to include what you want specifically. What do you want? If you want a furnace, do you want it installed by a licensed contractor? Well, I would. Does it remove that inspection contingency? Well, if your intention is that it shouldn't, even if they come to terms, the two of them, the two parties, if you want to reserve the right to terminate the offer within the 10-day period, then that has to be really spelled out as an exception within that addendum. We will also have some agents suggest that there's some addendum language that can be included in an addendum, a repair addendum, which says that this addendum shall not give the seller the right to terminate the contract. Is that going to hold? No. The reason is that it's an addendum that only one party has signed. So if you're going to use that language, if you're going to include that language that supersedes paragraph 15 of the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement, then you have to put it in the purchase agreement itself. so that by the time you get to page 6, all parties have agreed to a contract which includes the language that having inspections or providing a proposal regarding the inspections is not going to give the seller the unilateral right to terminate the contract. I hope that's clear, but if it's not, let us know. Dom has my screen up here, so if you have a question, post it on the live stream page. As I said earlier, can the buyer rescind the repair addendum? No. Once the buyer submits a repair addendum, they have opened the contract for renegotiation. Bear in mind, this only applies to the inspection paragraph, and as I said before, under some of the purchase agreements, I believe it's GCAR, they do have the right to rescind that prior to the end date of the inspection period, provided they do so before the seller acts and rejects it. So again, you have to really read the contracts and understand them. Is there a way to write an addendum which does not give the seller the right to terminate unilaterally? Again, no. You can't put that in as an afterthought in an addendum if it's not part of the original contract, because the seller is not obligated to anything that you write in an addendum until they sign it. So if you send over something that says, we want you to fix the furnace, and oh, by the way, this doesn't give you the right to terminate the contract, they haven't agreed to that. Now, if it's in the purchase agreement, they have agreed to that. So keep that in mind. You know, before you write the offer, if that's something that you want to include in the offer, it has to go in the purchase agreement portion that is signed by both parties. Let's see. What else do we have here? Isn't the seller, we get this one a lot, isn't the seller required to bring the property up to code? This one we get from a lot of first-time homebuyers who hear from their parents that, well, they have to bring that property up to code. They can't sell that property if it's not up to code. Well, yeah, they can, actually. And there is no responsibility whatsoever on the part of the seller to bring the property up to code, unless there is a specific city ordinance or municipal ordinance in place which requires it. For example, on the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement, I got this question just the other day. Buyer's agent called the seller's agent and said, oh, by the way, just want to make sure that the seller has installed smoke detectors throughout the house. And the seller's agent asked me, well, is that necessary? I mean, that they had inspections. They should have indicated that they wanted that in the inspection paragraph with some sort of addendum. And I said, well, but in this particular municipality, smoke detectors are required as part of the city ordinance. It's a city ordinance that they have smoke detectors. So if the seller is not in compliance now with regarding smoke detectors and the ordinance in that municipality, they have to bring those up to code before they can close. We used to have the Grand Rapids area, we used to have sidewalk inspections. I couldn't close without a sidewalk inspection. So, thankfully they've gotten rid of that because it was always kind of a headache. But it was an ordinance which required that the seller have their property checked and the sidewalk not have cracks and breaks in it before they closed on the property. They've gotten rid of it, but it was an ordinance in the city. And so if you look under paragraph 16 of the West Michigan Purchase Agreement, you will see that if it is an ordinance like smoke detectors or certificates of compliance and so on, that you have to have those done regardless of what the inspection contingency says or doesn't say. Let's see what else we have here. Does a buyer's investigations extend to evaluating school districts? I have a little gap here. School district, such sex offender registry, or the location of the nearest school bus stop. No. Again, under the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement, the answer is no, because the inspections are spelled out very clearly about the availability of insurance, whether or not the zoning will allow for the purchaser's intended use, and about flood insurance. It doesn't say anything about any other investigations. So if your buyer intends to do investigations about school districts or the distance between the property and their school of choice or whatever, that had better be spelled out in the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement. Now, again, GCAR, under the GCAR PA, Purchase Agreement, the inspections are not limited to those things. So in their case, the answer is yes. It could extend as far as examining and evaluating school districts, checking the sex offender registry, where the school bus stop is, how far it is to the school. All of those investigations fall under the but not limited phrase that is included in the GCAR inspections and investigations paragraph. Again, you have to know what your individual purchase agreements say. Can a buyer do their own inspections or ask their uncle to do the inspections? Yes. There's no requirement for that a buyer hire an inspector according to most of the purchase agreements we use. Now again, of the three I have here today, none of them require that they hire an inspector. However, I want to be very careful. Under GCAR, for example, if you submit a repair addendum asking for concessions or repairs, it also requires that you provide the reports that substantiate, and quotes, that substantiate that repair. Okay? In other words, you can't just say, based on repairs, buyer wants $3,000 in seller concessions, or seller to pay $3,000 in closing costs, or replace the furnace, or whatever. You have to provide the documentation which requires or supports that request under the GCAR purchase agreement. Under the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement, you don't have to do that. You don't have to provide any documentation. You can simply say, this is what we want. The buyer or the seller's agent can then ask you, well, do you have any reports to that effect? Do you have any reason documentation that you can provide which would cause you to ask for those things? And then the question is, do you want to provide them? Are you able to provide them? Obviously, if they do these inspections on their own, then the likelihood is they may not actually have them. When you look at the West Michigan Purchase Agreement, I pulled a copy this morning just for you. And there's a whole bunch under. I started with paragraph 14, the well and septic inspection, and paragraph 15, and as I said earlier, paragraph 16. So, under the well and septic inspection, a couple of things I want to point out. If any report of the well and septic inspection, if any report discloses a condition unsatisfactory to buyer or doesn't meet county standards that are a condition of the sale, buyer may, within 3 days after the buyer has received the report, by written notice to seller, either terminate this agreement and receive a refund of the good faith estimate, or make a written proposal for the seller to fix it. If the buyer fails to make that written proposal within the above referenced 3 days, then the buyer will be deemed to have accepted the property of the well and septic as is. The seller will respond in writing within 3 days to the buyer's request. If the seller fails to respond, they ignore you, or to arrive at a mutually agreeable resolution within 3 days after the seller's receipt of the buyer's proposal, the buyer will have 3 days to provide written notice of termination and receive good faith deposit. If they fail to terminate within that 3 days, then the buyer will proceed to closing and accept the property as is. Notice in there, under the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement, it does not give the seller the right to unilaterally terminate the contract if the buyer asks for a repair or concessions under the well and septic inspection paragraph. It does, however, ask for that or say that in the inspections portion, paragraph 15. It allows very specifically a buyer or someone selected by the buyer has the right to inspect the buildings and so on. It is a buyer's responsibility to investigate whether the property complies with the applicable codes and local ordinances. Again, we talked a little about that. And whether the property is zoned for the buyer's intended use. Number 2, whether the homeowner's insurance policy can be purchased at terms acceptable to the buyer. And number 3, whether the property is in a flood zone. That is a limitation of investigations under the West Michigan Purchase Agreement. But the other 2 purchase agreements that I have here don't have that limitation. They say, but not limited to. And that opens it up to allowing investigations for other reasons other than the 3 that are mentioned here. Okay. When you have, under, again, West Michigan Purchase Agreement, you have 10 days to have anything inspected that you want. And if you run into houses that have swimming pools, chimneys, underground sprinkling, you may want to have a mold inspection done. You may want to have a radon inspection done. All of those things, the buyer has a right to have performed within 10 days, and within that 10 days, they have to respond to the seller if they want to either terminate the offer. They have to respond in writing in the form of an addendum to terminate the offer, or to ask for some concessions or repairs. Again, under the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement, I'll read the phrase, seller may negotiate with buyer or by written notice to buyer, accept the buyer's proposal or terminate this listing. They can say, thanks, glad you sent us an offer, and we're done, goodbye. But then under 16, paragraph 16, it clearly says the seller will arrange and pay for certain certificates of occupancy, sidewalk compliance, and smoke detector ordinances if applicable. And that paragraph is the one that we addressed the other day when I got the call. Does the seller have to put smoke detectors in? Well, the answer is yes, because they were supposed to have them all along under the city's smoke detector ordinance. Got a call this morning about new construction. Most municipalities, in fact, I know of none, that don't require a certificate of occupancy for new construction. When a builder pulls the permits to put, the foundation in and to put the well and the septic and build the house, before they can get a certificate of occupancy from the township, the municipality, city, or whatever, the inspector, the city or municipal inspector, has to come out and inspect those things to make sure that they are operating, that they were installed properly. So the seller is required to do that under paragraph 16, municipal compliances. Again, West Michigan Purchase Agreement, not the other two. We're going to put this off to the side for a bit. How are you doing on time, Don?
35 minutes.
How much?
35 minutes.
We're 35 minutes in, so we're going to make this real quick. This is the Northern Great Lakes Regional Realtors Multiple Listing Service. And just want to read to you. This offer is contingent upon the satisfactory inspections of the buyer's choice at the buyer's expense no later than blank number of days. So they're not limited to 10 days. They're not limited to 5 days. They're not limited to 2 weeks. You can put in there whatever number of days you feel it's going to take, and the seller can choose to accept that or not. These inspections may include, but may not be limited to, and that's the little catchphrase that really opens up these investigations to anything they want. Any request by the buyer in writing to modify this agreement based on the results shall terminate this agreement unless the request is agreed to by the seller in writing, or B, the buyer removes the inspection contingency in writing within the time for inspections. If you're using the Northern Michigan, Northern Great Lakes Realtors Multiple Listing Service, it's important that you understand that language. What it's telling you is that they perceive that the addendum, a repair addendum, is a termination of the contract, that the buyer is terminating the previous offer that they have, unless the seller agrees to it. It's different language than what the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement is. And it does give the option of the buyer saying, backpedaling at day 8 or 9 or 10 or whatever and saying, wait a minute, we take that back. Never mind. We're going to move forward and head for the closing. It does allow that, whereas the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement does not allow that. Okay, that's that one. A lot of you are using GCAR. So I pulled GCAR out today. And again, under GCAR, it says items buyer should evaluate, include, but are not limited to the following. Again, that opens it up so that they can evaluate school districts, distance to the school, whether there's someone on the sex offender registry living nearby. All of those things can be investigated by the buyer, and they have 10 days in theirs. However, under the well and septic inspection, unlike the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement, which is the seller has to order those within 10 days, in this case, the seller has to order them within 5 days. So again, there are differences that in each purchase agreement that you're using. So be sure that you understand the inspection paragraphs in the purchase agreements that you're going to be using. And if you don't, if you read through them and it makes no sense, you just can't wrap your head around it, give Eric or me a call. We will pull those purchase agreements up so that we can work through them with you so that you get a clear understanding of what's expected of you when the inspection contingency is involved. And if he or I can't give you an answer, we'll call Gail Anderson and we'll get some sort of clarity from our attorney on that. So I know we've gone over. I thought it was an important subject, and there's a lot to it. So I hope this has been helpful, and I appreciate you all joining. Any questions before I sign off, Don? Okay. If you have any questions, please feel free to add them there, and I will respond at my earliest opportunity. Thanks for joining. Bye.